for the masses.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army.
If the game is rigged, change the game. Game changer.
I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
This is Fade to Black with your host, Jimmy Church, on the Game Changer Radio Network and KGRA, the Global Radio Alliance.
I need your help to get to the year 1985.
You're listening to Fade to Black with Jimmy Church on the Game Changer Network.
Good evening. Fade to Black. Bespoke Radio. For the masses. Yeah, man. Here we go. Today's Wednesday, December 4th, 2019. 338 days into the new year, just 27 days left. We are live from a bunker somewhere in the middle of beautiful downtown Burbank, California. And I would like to welcome everybody listening all around the world, all across the United States. Hither and thither, to and fro, back and forth, east and west, north and south, far and near. This is Fade to Black for KJCR, the Game Changer Network, and KGRA, the planet. I am your host, Jimmy Church. All right. What is cracking, everybody? How you doing? How you doing? I've been looking forward to this show for many years. Tonight we have very special guests, Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince. Unbelievable. That's right, live from the UK. And they are here to discuss their new book, When God Had a Wife. I'm holding it up to the camera there. There you go. There's the cover. You can head over to jimmychurchradio.com and click on their links and go and get yourself a copy of this. This is a great, great read. We'll be discussing this book tonight. Tomorrow night, Deep Prasad is joining us live from India. And that will complete our first-time guest week here on Fade to Black, and it has been amazing. Greg Braden on Monday night, just an absolutely incredible show. Last night, I think, will go down in history as the night that Neil called in. Wow. What a great night last night on the show. And then tonight, of course, we have Lynn and Clive here. Tomorrow night, Deep Prasad. And to get things started tonight, follow me on Twitter at JChurchRadio. That's what you want to do, at JChurchRadio. And hashtag F2B is the sandbox. You can join the conversation there. We will do a few thousand tweets tonight during the show. And you can engage in the conversation right there with all the other Fadernauts right there. Hashtag F2B. Any questions or comments for myself tonight or our guests, Lynn and Clive, you can post it right there at hashtag F2BQ on Twitter. Okay? We are going to discuss a lot tonight with history and, of course, lost history and religion. And these are questions that we all have as we go through our life's journey. And tonight, with Lynn and Clive, two of the best guests that we can have to ask these questions and pursue these answers. So you can do that right there, hashtag F2BQ. You can also email throughout the show, of course, at jimmychurchradio.com. Lynn and Clive have researched historical and religious mysteries, authoring such bestsellers as The Stargate Conspiracy and The Templar Revelation, which directly inspired the Da Vinci Code. Frequent speakers at conferences around the world. They regularly appear on TV series such as Forbidden History, History's Ultimate Spies, and the Medieval Murder Mysteries. Tonight, we're going to discuss their new book, When God Had a Wife, where they reveal the spiritual legacy of the Jewish goddesses. And, of course, we'll examine the title itself, When God Had a Wife. The links for everything are over at jimmychurchradio.com, and visit their website, picknettprince.com. And I would like to welcome for the first time to Fade to Black, Clive Prince and Lynn Picknett. Good evening, you two. Good morning, actually. How are you?
Good morning and good evening, or whatever it is.
We're doing very well with the coffee.
Yeah, right on. And before we get started, you get the first time guest disclaimer. Now, the next time you're on the show, you don't get it, but tonight you do, which is this. Lynn and Clive, it's just the three of us sitting on my couch having a conversation as friends. And where the conversation starts, it starts. Where it ends. But we're going to end as friends. There you go. You ready to go?
Yep.
Yeah, ready when you are.
Yeah, the first time guest disclaimer started many, many years ago. I don't know how it did, but the audience would not let me not do it after that. I would get it in real time. I'd get tweets and emails. Jimmy, you forgot the first time. So it's a tradition, and it's an honor that I'm able to do it tonight with the two of you. And let's actually let's do this. I want to go back to the beginning of everything, but it's actually a simple question that we're going to start with. Did the research, it's kind of like the chicken or the egg thing. Did the research and the interest happen because it was something that intrigued you? Or did the research and the revelations happen because you wanted to stir the pot and go against the grain? Which one was it?
You mean the beginning of our career?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, no, we began our career because we were absolutely intrigued by the Shroud of Turin. And then it was suddenly declared, a fake. And we thought, well, it's a fake, we agree, but it's the most remarkable fake ever. So we actually were so red hot on that. And we eventually got offered a book deal. And that's the beginning of our career in 1994.
And I think, just thinking about your question, I think really for us it started, and each book comes about. It's just because we think we have something to say. We think we've notice something or come across something that other people haven't, or that we want to bring things to people's awareness. So I think that's really what motivates us in all of our books. It's just we get to a point, we research these things because we're interested. We love mysteries, we want to try and solve mysteries, and there comes a point where we actually think, we've got something to say that we think people will want to listen to. But we'd be doing this kind of thing anyway because it's just what we're about.
And very early on, you must have learned some techniques in fighting back, right? Because you are definitely stirring the pot and going against academia, going against accepted religious dogma that has been ingrained for millennia, and you've got to prepare for another fight, right?
Well, yes. Every book really turns out to be a bit of a fight. Although, as Clive said, we never set out to do that. It's just the nature of, what we discover. So basically, we just grit our teeth and say what we want to say. And, we don't have any great technique for fighting back because often the opposition, if you like, the form it takes is a sort of resounding silence, as the old phrase, they wouldn't give us the oxygen of publicity.
Right. And so because of that, and I totally appreciate that. And because of that, do you now not care what the critics have to say? You're going to do what you're going to do anyway.
Yes, that's right. I think that's something we came to a long time ago, is that, we have, if we're going to do what we're going to do, we're just going to have to ignore the critics or or respond to them. I mean, a lot of the things we write, say, particularly in the new book, that appear to most, a sort of mass audience as being sort of controversial, are in fact things that are well known within academia. We've often found this with the books that we've written, that things that the specialists in these subjects, the scholars in these subjects, know and talk about among themselves and publish papers about in obscure sort of academic journals and other publications. And then, we come along and say this should reach a wider public, more people should know about this, and then we put it out there, and then critics start saying, well, this is outrageous and controversial, and they're just making it up. But we're actually quoting, proper scholarly sources. It's almost like there's a kind of filter that information doesn't get through, particularly in religious matters. There is a block that specialists, scholars in the Bible have known for a long time certain things, but nobody ever tells the churchgoer about them. I think there is a sort of block in there.
Well, we don't write this stuff just because we're a naughty boy and girl.
Right. Well,
not just.
Not just, but there's another aspect to this too as well, because when you first started off your career, you have a certain amount of freedom, because at that point you're still a little bit invisible, if you know what I'm saying. So, and then everything took off. And when it took off in 97, 98, 99, it couldn't have taken off any bigger, where everything just exploded. And now you are very visible. And how did you guys handle that with everybody coming at you from every direction? The entire world was talking about these subjects.
Well, it was really a bit later than you said. It was really with the Da Vinci Code, because Dan Brown based a lot of his content on our book, The Templar Revelation, which had come out in 1997. So it was in the early years of the 21st century, it really was almost overwhelming, because actually by pure coincidence, if one believes in such things, we shared a publisher with Dan Brown. And in those days, he didn't really do much publicity outside of the States. So we actually were asked to do a lot of publicity almost on his behalf over here. So we did, a lot of stuff, as you can imagine. We did debates with academics and with church people. And, we got quite a lot of abuse. Let's put it that way. Quite a lot. We've been patronized and condescended to by the best, I'll tell you.
Yeah. And which is exactly my point to all of this, where you had one life and now you are certainly living another life where you're being watched and questioned and observed, whereas before things were probably a lot more simple, right?
I guess so, yes. I mean, before we met, or when we met, Lynn had kind of been part of the kind of the parapsychological scene, really. So Lynn was more used to it than I was. I used to have like a proper office job at the time. The whole area of actually even dealing with the media and things was very new to me. So Lynn had been used to it because she'd been in the media for quite a while before then. But over the years, getting on these debates, learning how to handle criticism and attacks and hostility, because in the end you just have to keep bringing everyone back to the facts. Yeah. Because although obviously we come up with our own interpretation of those facts, really that's for everyone, that's for every reader to do for themselves. But what we're trying to establish is the basic grounding of the facts, the things that can't be argued with, and after that everything's interpretation. Obviously we have our own, but the important thing is to keep bringing everything back to the actual solid facts, the archaeology, the textual scholarship and all that kind of thing. So that's it. In the end, you just keep referring people back to that.
Do you feel that after the publication of the Templar Revelation and, of course, the Da Vinci Code and Dan Brown, that today almost the way that pop culture or the world looks back at this, it's now sort of transformed into a historical situation, a historical document where these ideas now are so cemented that they're accepted and outside of orthodox academia?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because actually sometimes it's just a case of Clive and I looking at each other and going, wow, looking back, because I mean, actually, it must be said, an awful lot of people throughout the world, have no idea who we are and no idea our part in the whole Dan Brown thing. But actually, because of us, I mean, it is true, false modesty aside, it is true that basically through us, Dan Brown certainly got the whole world almost talking about this huge global conversation about things like the Gnostic Gospels and the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, which, he was inspired to look at largely because of our book, The Templar Revelation. So, yes, we did. You're quite right. We did have a part in getting this global conversation going, which has indeed changed the world.
I firmly believe that, where today, not only are you two quoted, but the ideas that were presented are something that, it's openly discussed today. And this wasn't the case in the 80s or the 70s or in the past, where today we just accept it and we move forward. I find that exciting.
Absolutely, yes, and so do we, and it's great to be part of that. I was going to say movement; that might not be the right word, but for example, as Lynn was saying with the Da Vinci Code, before that book came about, most people were not aware of the existence, for example, of the Gnostic Gospels, which certainly exist, and again, one can interpret what they say and come to different conclusions. But the fact is that most people were actually unaware that these alternative gospels, these alternative texts about Jesus, giving a completely different picture, even existed. So when I said earlier that we keep trying to bring everything back to the facts, that's a classic example. The very fact that so many people didn't know that these sources existed and have existed for 2,000 years. So what one then does with it and how one interprets that is another question. But the fact is that that novel, Dan Brown's novel, brought that to a lot of people's attention and therefore did a great service to everyone.
And a wonderful irony that, you would have predicted, one would have predicted many, many years ago, if, the world was going to change, some great revelation, it would obviously come through some academic book or some academic revelation. And instead it came through an airport thriller.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And going back to the very genesis of the internet, and I'm talking about 1995. I'm goofing around. I'm doing research, and I stumbled on at that time the only little tiny website on René Le Chateau.
Oh yeah,
and I'm going and I'm reading. I'm like, holy crap! Right? Okay, what's going on here? There was no other resources for that out there, and that led to one thing, which led to another, which led me to the Turin Shroud, your book, which eventually, a couple of years later, of course, the Templar Revelation comes out. But it was those spider webs of research that all came off of René Le Chateau and for the rest of the world. I'm talking about Mary Magdalene and, of course, Jesus and southern France and Jerusalem and the Knights Templar and everything else that was going on. And that's what led me to you guys. And the world wouldn't have known really about René Le Chateau and everything that came off of that, the Sinclairs and Rosalind Chapel. All of these things tied themselves together, didn't they?
They did. And Yeah, it's a subject that we've written about as well in our books. We don't claim to have solved the mystery, but I think we've made some headway with it. But it's what we found, because same as you, during the kind of mid-90s, Lynn and I were getting very much interested in that whole mystery, and it was just amazing. When we interacted with other researchers, a whole community of people who, like yourself, had kind of stumbled across this and wanted to know more. And we used to think, just from that one tiny French village, we and other people, have ended up researching things like, the Kabbalah, the Gnostic Gospels, the Knights Templar, the Cathars, and then it spins out into things like alchemy and alchemical groups and strange, secret societies and Masonic groups. So many different subjects that we had to learn about if we didn't know about them already,
right,
and find out more about. All starting from just this one tiny village, in order to try and make sense of it all. And some of those things actually turned out not to be totally relevant to that central mystery anyway, but nevertheless, it takes you on to another place. You find out more about things. You find out a whole world, a whole history that you're not taught about in schools.
And the breadcrumbs, they're everywhere, right? One thing is leading to another, and you only have so much time in the day, so many days in the week. How do you choose which breadcrumb? Right.
Well, there's a certain amount of Picknett and Prince early research for every book begins in the pub. Obviously, we're Brits. That's what happens.
Fair enough.
But we'd sit there and just talk and freewheel, but of course, at this stage in our career, we've got background of quite a lot of books, as you know. And so one book tends to grow out of the past book, and which grew out of the book before that. So it's a kind of organic process. And as you say, the breadcrumbs, I mean, it's a question of sweeping them all up and looking at the pattern that they make, really.
I can only imagine, because when you look at, just as Clive just pointed out, that little village right in France, and with Rennes-le-Château, and what came out of it and off of it and around it throughout history. This wasn't just something modern in the 20th century.
Yeah, and it is the whole kind of hidden history. It's only because it's the kind of subjects that aren't really deemed suitable for study in schools, because the history you learn at school is all about kings and battles and things. You don't hear too much about history of ideas, and a lot of this actually comes back to alternative philosophies, alternative ways of looking at life, and it's not what. It's not what we're taught about. Just to give you an example, when I was back at school doing history, which was one of my favourite subjects, the period we were doing towards the kind of final exams was exactly the period of history that was to do with the Crusades, sort of the late medieval period, which was fascinating. But I was learning about kings and queens and battles and bishops. Two words that I never heard in the entire sort of school curriculum of that period. I never heard the word Templar, and I never heard the word Cathar, which of course are those two extremely important things happening in Europe at that period.
You would think, right?
So it's later on when you start to learn about these things, mainly from alternative history books, and you suddenly come across you suddenly learn about how important the Knights Templar were, just historically, without going into any of the kind of weird stuff about them, which is there. But suddenly you think, why has no one told me about this before? And you begin to think it looks like a cover-up. Now I think it's probably just the academic mind, or the people that set school curriculums, just don't think in that way. But it looks like that. And then you come across the Cathars and you think, why did nobody ever tell me about them? And suddenly whole new a whole new history, a real history, but one that you're never really taught, opens up.
Mind you, when I did history at school, that was so long ago I can barely remember it. So but I'm sure it was it was exactly as Clive said, very similar.
And with this, when God had a wife, because of the Jesus and Mary research and the way that the public now is very familiar with that subject. Did that make this book easier to write? Because this is going to ruffle some feathers.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I suppose it made certain bits towards the end of the book easier because we didn't have to explain so much about Mary Magdalene and the questions around them. We could assume that most readers know a fair bit about that. So it saved us words. It saved us making the book longer. But what we've done in this book is actually go back into the backstory of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, if you like. It's something that we've steadily. It began with Tempt Revelation back in 1997. It went through another book of ours called The Mask of Christ, which came out in 2008, and then both of which dealt with questions about Jesus and what he was about and what the connection with Mary Magdalene was, and where we kind of hinted at some things of where they drew their ideas from, what they were part of. And then carrying on that research, we actually kind of found the whole backstory in the religion of the Israelites. And that's when this book came together, that we could tell this whole history, essentially from Moses through to Jesus. But it just added a whole other dimension to things that we had written about before. It made much more sense of some of the things that we'd grappled with in those earlier books.
Now, yes, sorry, do go on.
Yeah, I was going to ask a question of you, Lynn, as we're heading into the break, and I so rudely interrupted you. But as a woman writing this book, was this your idea? Did you present this to Clive?
It's always my idea to write about Mary Magdalene. I mean, she's one of my favourites, and I have written a book myself about Mary Magdalene called Mary Magdalene, Christianity's Hidden Goddess. I mean, you can't stop me, basically.
So, Clive, when the book idea started to present itself, as a man, were you surprised at the way that academia was handling this over the years?
Absolutely, because that's as we started to look at the hard evidence, the academic evidence, the archaeology mainly, for the existence of a goddess tradition within the Hebrew religion that carries through into Christianity, and how so little of that had got out to the general public. It was a surprise because it's not, it's so solidly there that you think, well, why do these things not make the news? Well, they discover a new tomb in Egypt. There may be something about it on the news. They discover an inscription in Israel to the god Yahweh and his wife Asherah, which has such profound implications, and it ends up in a pretty obscure academic journal.
And I'm going to safely say this because of the way that this deals with, we're dealing with the feminine, the masculine here, male and female. And as a man, I realize that the suppression happened because of us, of us men. And reading the book, and I could not stop reading it, I was almost embarrassed for the way that it has been suppressed, and I found myself saying over and over again, why is this not being discussed? Well, the reasons are obvious, and we'll talk about it after. But for both of you, as quickly as we can before the break, why the suppression?
Oh, it's a big question, and in fact, something that we've been discussing amongst ourselves a lot over the time, because it's very easy to show the suppression happening, but you still do end up with this question of why. We often get into a thing of, is it because of just basic misogyny on the part of men?
Right.
Or is misogyny a consequence of having written the feminine out of religion? It's like, which came first? And it's sometimes hard to tell, but after the break we can talk about what we think happened and why this happened. But it's very easy to show that it did happen when you start looking at the motives, because of the damage it actually does to the male psyche. You wonder why men wanted it to happen.
That's exactly my point. And I found myself asking that fundamental question over and over again. And I think what is most important here is the facts are the facts, right? The book is black and white and very pragmatic. That you can read that part of it, but we have to get to the fundamental question of why. And we'll discuss all of that after the break. Let's take our break right here. This is Fade to Black. I am your host, Jimmy Church. Our guests tonight are Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince. We are discussing their new book. I'm holding it up to the cameras right now, When God Had a Wife. Tonight on the Game Changer Network and KGRA The Planet, this is Fade to Black. We'll be right back after this short break. Stay with us. All right, welcome back. Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Our guests tonight, Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince, discussing their book, When God Had a Wife. And we're going to get straight to it right now. And all roads lead to Egypt. All roads lead to Egypt. They just seem to do that. And we're going to actually start there. And before we do, I'm going to ask both of you the same question, and I'm wondering if you're going to give me the same answer. Is the Bible a historical document? Clive, you first.
Good question. No, I would say no. It's a document that is based on history, but it's history that's been interpreted. Now, actually, you could probably say that about anything, any aspect of history, because as soon as you write it, you change it. But the crucial thing to understand about the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, is that although it's based on sources that go way, way back, it was actually put together quite late. When I say quite late, I'm talking about sort of the middle, sort of around about 450 BC. Whereas things like, say, the Exodus happened about 800 years before that. So you got all this information, these sources that were passed down, but there was a big effort in Jerusalem, say around 450 BC, to actually codify the religion and the beliefs, which also meant putting together the historical narrative, because the two things are very closely intertwined about how, Moses' revelation with the burning bush and, the whole story that comes on from there. Now, bits and pieces of the Hebrew Bible have been passed down pretty faithfully, and it's mainly the bits that are called the songs. So when you come across these songs that are inserted into the story, which often actually have a slightly contradictory element to them to what the narrative part of the story says, that you can take them a bit more seriously, but a lot of it was quite blatantly rewritten around that time. It was actually at this point, that rewriting around the middle of the 5th century BC, that's when the sacred feminine was written out, and it was as late as that. And it's like all these things when people write history is written by the victors, as we know. They erased the sacred feminine from the religion at that point, and then they rewrote the history to pretend it had never been there. And what's been reconstructed from archaeology and other scholarly work is to show actually until that stage that there was a goddess in that religion, a consort of the god. Yeah.
What I would say, very annoyingly, in answer to your question whether the Bible is a historical record, I would have said it is and it isn't, but it was pretty much what Clive said. Yes, we do have to bear in mind that as long as we, for the sake of argument, remove the idea that it was somehow written by God, what you're left with is a historical document that is open to interpretation, just like any other. And basically, bear in mind, as Clive said, that history is written by the victors, and they can present what they like to people. And let's not forget that people in those days, most of them couldn't read or write. So when they're given some document, they would tend to be awestruck by it and think it must be true. And also that there was a tendency to exaggerate enormously. Historians now saying, well, certain things just didn't happen. The Exodus didn't happen. Solomon's temple didn't happen. Even Solomon didn't happen. But actually, this is probably just simply exaggeration. Solomon's temple was there, but it was much smaller, much less grand than we are led to believe. So basically, yes, some of the Bible is historical, but it's overlaid with layers and layers of hype, basically.
And you guys present that position in that I feel that you remain objective. Right, that's where
we try.
We try. Yeah,
you remain objective because, just like you just pointed out, Lynn, there when you're talking about Solomon's temple and David and that period, clearly referenced in the Bible, but all of the civilizations around Israel at that time, they don't make any reference to it at all.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which is what leads some. There is a whole strand within biblical scholarship. People called biblical minimalists is what the name given to them, who basically deny. They say if there's no evidence, independent evidence for something that happened in the Bible, then it didn't happen. So it's almost a fundamentalist position from the opposite point of view. If we can't prove it happened, then we're going to assume it didn't. And what we found when we looked into this is that, no, these things did happen, as Lynn said, just on a smaller scale than we're led to believe from those texts. For an example, I think when the Bible talks about the Exodus from Egypt, it said it was 600,000 men and their wives and children, which is a couple of million people suddenly leaving Egypt. Now, people have looked at that and said, that is just impossible. That many people leaving Egypt would have left a big mark on history. Because that big mark isn't there, it didn't happen. But when you actually look at it from the other point of view, you say, actually, it did happen. It's just that number of 600,000 they just exaggerated it when these stories were written down many centuries later. It did happen, but on a much smaller scale. And then, the archaeology does fit that on a much smaller scale of, So,
well, let me jump in because I don't want this thought to get away from me. I wanted to ask you this specifically about biblical minimalist, in that did you ever consider yourselves biblical minimalist at one point, and did that change for you?
I don't think we ever did, because I think we always just assumed there was a core of historical truth. When we first came into the subject, I think we just assumed there was a core of historical truth and went looking for it. And it was quite a while into that you actually came across this very extreme position of the biblical minimalists. And then you look at it and you think, well, let's try this out. Have they got a point? Let's look at their evidence. Right. But it didn't take long to actually think, no, actually, they just become, they're almost too legalistic. They're like lawyers. If you can't prove it happened, it didn't. And we saw that, no, it's too simple an approach to history. I mean, history is more complicated than that.
But there is a moment when you discover that the the lack of evidence, where you think, what's going on? I mean, many, many years ago, before I met Clive, before I got on this path, I went to the British Museum, and in my naivety, I asked one of the attendants, where the stuff was, where the exhibits were for the Israelites in Egypt, and he looked pityingly at me and said, "There isn't any," and it was like I thought, what? What's going on here? I mean, I didn't know that there was just absolutely nil evidence in that sense, or at least in those days. I mean, talking about many years ago now. So that was a bit of a shock to me. So basically, you have to start really forensically as Clive said, forensically looking at the evidence, sifting it, which is what we like to think we do in every case.
And then we come to the very fundamental aspect of it all, which is we have been, and I include myself in that, we have been led to believe that God was independent, right? He was doing his own thing. And when we start talking about this aspect of, did God have a wife? Was he, did he have somebody that was standing by his side? Was there no, that's without question. That is the dogma today, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and that is really, I think, the big thing for us. The big, perhaps in its way, the most shocking revelation is to realise that we've always been brought up to believe that the whole Bible story from beginning to end, Old Testament and New, is about monotheism, people that worshipped and believed in just one God, one male God. But this is actually not true. When I was talking earlier about this reinvention, the codifying of the religion in the 5th century BC, it's not until that point that the Israelites, the Hebrews, actually became monotheist. The Israelites of, say, Moses' time, from Solomon's time, of all that period, despite what the Hebrew Bible says, it's now known absolutely were not monotheists. They were what's called monolaters, which is a distinction. Monolatry is where you worship one particular god while still acknowledging the existence of others, and it's normally your tribal god. And this is just known amongst in academia as a fact. And the strange thing is that even the historical books of the Hebrew Bible don't pretend otherwise. They don't talk about God as being the only God. They just talk about him being the one that the people of Israel have pledged themselves to worship. There are phrases in the Bible like where people say, people praising God say, "Who among the gods is like you, O Lord?" And other gods are mentioned throughout the Bible, and it's not really until you get to a fairly late period that you actually get the statement that there is only one God. In the earlier books, the first commandment, for example, you shall have no other God before me, doesn't say there aren't any other gods. And that, in some ways, that's the big kind of psychological breakthrough that we made during the thing. It takes a hell of a lot of, we've been conditioned so much and for so long to believe this monotheist story. It takes actually a big effort of will to break through that. It
does. And I mean, there are some rewrites, not just reinterpretations, but rewrites deliberately, so to prevent us knowing this in a way. I mean, for example, originally there was the phrase, the sons of God. Like an assembly, almost like a Star Wars type assembly, which became actually angels, So right. Entirely different setup, entirely different understanding. But originally they were the sons of God. And also there's, the plural gods right at the beginning. It's, and the gods created, not God, and the gods, plural, created. And not all of those divine beings were male.
And going back to where we started, this is a great setup for that, in that all roads lead back to Egypt. Egypt, and certainly with the demigods, and going back to the prehistory of Egypt, the pre-Pharaoh ages, Egyptians didn't have any issues with a strong feminine presence. In fact, it was half of everything that their culture was based on, wasn't it?
Yes, I mean, I think all ancient cultures, but it's very noticeable in Egypt that it has this balance between male deities and female deities. Not to say that these cultures weren't patriarchal. Egypt certainly was, but nevertheless, they still have this, reverence for the female, the sacred feminine. It's just the recognition. In a way, you can't have a family without a mother and father. So you need the two. So it's very much, you'd expect the ancient Israelites from the time of Moses to have that same balance. And then when you look at the text, you find actually they did. It's just that there was a long process by which the other deities were gradually screened out. And then eventually, every male god, every male deity was expected to have his consort, his wife. And that applied to Yahweh, the biblical Jehovah, as much as any. And it was quite late that they eventually decided that to divorce him, basically, to get him divorced.
Actually, just interjecting about, it's true that all civilizations in the time we're talking about, over the course of thousands of years, but they were generally patriarchal. But having said that, ancient Egypt was the least patriarchal in the way it treated certainly its upper class women, let's be honest.
Yes.
Because they could instigate divorce, for heaven's sake. That's amazing. They could own property. It was quite astonishing compared to, much later, obviously, but compared to Greek and Roman treatment of women, which was disgraceful. They basically locked them away. They had no voice. They were treated like chattel. But in Egypt, it was different. And that was... We can't say for certain that was down to their religion, but it certainly helped.
Well, and it seems that, from my perspective, that we have left Egypt's history alone. We haven't erased the feminine side of it, but we certainly have throughout history with just about everything else. And that's perplexing to me.
It is, and it is to us in a way, because the debate we've often had is why, the question you asked earlier, why did this happen? And from a modern perspective, the immediate response would be, well, it's because they were misogynists, they just hated women. But that could be too simple an answer, because there was a big difference between patriarchy and actually outright misogyny. If you think about, Lynn was saying the ancient Greeks and Romans treated their women appallingly, but they still had their goddesses and their goddess cults. They didn't try and erase them in the way that happened in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So that as I said earlier, which came first, which was the cause and which was the effect. But certainly you can trace that process happening until there's a final moment where basically the goddess is kicked out, of that tradition. But Egypt is very important. I mean, we do feel that the evidence is very strong that of a big influence of Egyptian religion on the original Israelite religion, the religion of Moses. It's a controversial area. Many scholars kind of reject that, but we actually do think there's very strong evidence of a direct connection between the Israelite religion, the religion of Yahweh or Jehovah. Has a lot more taken from Egypt than a lot of people would think, and that actually it was a whole core of Egyptians, not Hebrew slaves coming out of Egypt, but the Moses and the people around him in the original priesthood were actually Egyptian. They had Egyptian names, for example.
Yeah, when I read that in the book, I was like, hold on a minute here. We got to pump the brakes. I got to stop. I got to stop right there. And we're going to come back to that. Lynn, we need to discuss Asherah. And the reason why I want to do this directly, and you point this out in the book, going back into the historical record for anything else, you can find stuff, you can find references, but when we come to the subject of Asherah, now it gets clouded. You actually have to work for this information, don't you?
Well, you do, largely because for centuries, scholars thought the reference to Asherim in the Old Testament was just a strange tree cult. It seemed to refer to trees, and they didn't really know what it meant, but they just thought, well, who cares? It's nothing much. But it transpires with modern, largely speaking, modern scholarship that actually referring to trees that were set up as symbols of the goddess Asherah, who was, in fact, God's wife.
And let's stay right there. Side by side, right?
Yeah.
Side by side. Now this gets really interesting here, right? We're talking about the representations were there side by side, one being a pillar, one being a tree.
Yeah. The pillar represented Yahweh, and the tree representing Asherah. And although there were no graven images of Yahweh allowed, or indeed really of anybody allowed, certainly later in Solomon's temple, Yahweh was worshipped, but so was Asherah. And actually, she was an official part of the religion. And this is astonishing, isn't it? That people just don't know this.
No. I said to you earlier off air, I found myself putting down the book so many times going, why isn't this being discussed? Yeah. So, okay, we're going to be talking about Asherah quite a bit, and we're going to head towards the break. Who was Asherah?
Asherah was a goddess. She's also known from the Canaanite sources. This is what gave the clue to what the Asherah mentioned in the Bible is. And she was under the Canaanite and, to an extent, the Israelite religion, the big main god was a god called El. And he had a consort, a wife, who helped him in the act of creating the world, and was the mother of the lesser gods. And that's exactly the role she has in the Hebrew Bible. Although it's been rewritten so much, it's hard to sort of untangle it, but it's there. So she was essentially, the big mother goddess, the consort of the big god, the chief god, and the two of them together were the parents of the lesser deities. And who, as Lynn said, became angels later in the Bible. But that's who she was. She was the big goddess, the mother goddess, the mother of the gods, as well as co-creator of humanity. And
it's beyond a scandal, isn't it? That people just don't know. Well, they will now.
Yeah, well, and El was the Hebrew name for God, and what was hers?
She was called Asherah too, because El was both the Canaanite and the Hebrew name. Because the god of the book of Genesis is El exclusively throughout that. There comes a point when Moses has this experience with the burning bush that God's name changes to Yahweh. And that's portrayed in the Bible as it's the same God. It's just referred to as a different name. And then pretty much the majority of times after that point, God is now Yahweh. When you reconstruct the thing, you realize it was obviously in the beginning, they were two separate gods. El was the big creator god. Yahweh was one of the second rank, one of the sons of El, who was given the people of Israel, the nation of Israel, as the nations of the earth were divided amongst the sons of El, and Yahweh got Israel, which is why it had this special one-to-one relationship. Although it's portrayed in the Bible as if it's El and Yahweh are just two names for the same God, when you reconstruct the whole thing and look at it in the right way and you compare it to, say, the Canaanite legends, it's very clear there were originally two separate deities, a high one and a lower one. And during that later rewriting, that whole thing got fudged and changed. But it can be reconstructed.
I mean, the thing to remember is that it was desperately unusual to have just one God in those days. It was abnormal. It was unnatural to have just one God. It was the total norm across the civilized world was to have a pantheon or a range of gods who had different functions, just like the Catholic saints, which is a reflection of that.
Was there a Hebrew feminine version of El?
Yes, there is sometimes referred to as Elat in some inscriptions.
That's where I'm going, right?
Oh, yeah.
and we're at that, and I was just thinking, that's what I'm on about. How is that not referenced today?
Well, there are actually inscriptions that have been found. This is where the archaeology becomes important. There are inscriptions that have been found. There are two. This is obviously before the rewriting of the text and the compiling of it into this, what became the Hebrew Bible. But from that earlier period, you actually have found inscriptions to Yahweh and his Asherah. The two of them as a couple. There have been several examples of this found. There's also one sometimes called Elat. But that shows you, rather than the later writings that have been edited in the light of what they wanted the religion to be, the archaeology shows you what the people of the time believed. And, there are these figurines of the Asherah figure that have been found throughout Israel from the earlier period. I mean, literally thousands of them.
Yeah,
figures.
Yeah, let me jump in right there, Clive. I got to take a break, and we're going to talk about those figurines when we come back. They are absolutely fascinating to look at. This is Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Tonight, Lynn Picknett, Clive Prince. We're discussing their new book, released yesterday here in the United States, When God Had a Wife. We'll be right back. Stay with us. Welcome back. Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Great show tonight. I want to remind everybody, tomorrow night, we're not doing open lines. Tomorrow night, live from India, Deep Prasad is joining the show. So that'll be tomorrow night. Tonight, it's Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince. We're discussing their new book, When God Had a Wife. And by the way, I've got the title for your next book. When God Had a Mom. That's it. That's the next book. That's the next book. Well, as I was reading through it, I want to get back to Asherah in just a second, but Kaddish. I hope I'm saying it right. And I went back. By the way, I want everybody to know that the book is full of notes and references back to all of their research and I like a good spy novel like anybody, But it's books like this where I'm actually able to work and research and reference that means so much to me, and this book is full of that. And when I got to Kaddish, is that how you say it?
We say Kadesh, but
we don't know. We don't know either. So,
yeah.
you know.
I mean, no one really knows because they didn't have vowels in those days, so everyone has to guess.
Right. So, tomato, tomato.
Yep.
Is that God's mom?
Well, no. Well, it depends which God you're talking about, because there's this thing of saying earlier El, the big God, and Yahweh originally being one of the sons, the second level God. Now, a strange thing happened over the course of the evolution of the religion that we go into. It's a bit of a complicated story, but we go to in the book that over time Asherah, who started off as the wife of El, in later belief got transferred to Yahweh, to the son, and was then worshipped in the temple alongside Yahweh, as Lynn was saying. The thing with Kadesh is that, like all the ancient goddesses, Asherah had her different aspects and her different names. Although she was the mother goddess primarily, the wife of the big god, she also had her fertility and her very erotic aspect. And this is the one that, when people talk about Kadesh, that's the side of her they're talking about. So this is her in her kind of sexy,
raunchy.
That's
yeah,
the word.
raunchy.
So Asherah's, think of her as the mother. Kadesh is she's still the mother, but she's, as Lynn said, raunchy.
I read it in a different way. Yeah, I did, and from what, like I said, everybody's got a mom and dad. And, and I'm just wondering where God came from. And that's your next book. I'm just saying, that's your next book. Getting back to these figurines, and I went and looked at all of these amazing images on the web. And this is something that, again, until this book and the references, I had no clue about. And I looked at the collections, and the fascinating thing for me, and I want to know why only the waist up?
Well, these figurines, which they're very small, kind of little models, they seem to be emphasizing the goddess, emphasizing Asherah as mother, as nurturer. So there's a great emphasis on the breasts, but not in an erotic way. It's as nurturing, as nursing. So
the legs are irrelevant.
Yeah, the legs are there are no legs, and that's my point. They're on, how do I say this? They're on stands, right? Am I describing that correctly?
That's it. I mean, partly they're called pillar-based figurines.
Pillar-based.
Part of the legs aren't there because to give them a base to stand up on. But I would just say that there are other images of Asherah in her Kadesh mode, and they do show everything from the waist down in quite graphic detail. So it depends which bit you're honouring. But these figurines, which were there, they're found literally, something like 3,000 of them throughout Israel, in Jerusalem, all from the period, the Israelite period. I think that's sort of 7th to 8th century BC. And they're obviously very, very popular images. They're very domestic.
Yeah, and I should add that, of course, you have to bear in mind that although, as Clive said, there are about 3,000 of them, they're the only ones that have been found. I mean, imagine how many there actually were, that have got destroyed over the years. I mean, it just shows you how beloved she was, how revered, and how she was a part of everyday life, because ordinary people would have had these little figurines around their homes, no matter how modest. So she was actually an integral part of their everyday worship.
And
another important thing, if I can just quickly put it in, is that we have, say, literally thousands of them found throughout the history of that. But then when you get to this period in the middle of the 5th century BC, when the religion was codified and made into dogma, they utterly disappear. There hasn't been a single one found that's dated from after that period. So it's like suddenly there's a big clampdown, and these beloved images that were so popular before, you're now not allowed to have them.
Actually, that's a very good point. Sorry, but it's just that, it was codifying the Judaic religion that essentially got rid of the goddess, and it was codifying the Christian religion that essentially got rid of the goddess.
Mm.
Yes. Yeah.
And we're going to come back to this, but there's another part. They were just her figurines that were found in these homes. There wasn't a male side. There wasn't a male figurine found, right?
There was a prohibition on representing Yahweh, so that would probably explain it. But at the same time, yes, they would concentrate on what they could see visually, I think, because, the idea of a God that you couldn't see and you couldn't represent would be a bit vague to the average person. And I think the idea of a mother who you could represent and have a little figurine of, or for that matter, a grand mummy image, made a lot of sense to them.
So what we can deduce from all of this is that the Hebrew side of things, the Israelite side of things, Asherah was represented and revered and worshipped alongside God, and that was the basis of their culture.
Absolutely. Again, reading between the lines of the Old Testament, you can reconstruct that. And for example, one really telling thing is if you look at the story as told throughout the Hebrew Bible, you get this feeling that the people of Israel always worshipped Yahweh and Yahweh alone, but that occasionally they turned to the worship of other gods and to Asherah in particular, and put her image in the Jerusalem temple as well. But and then some king or another would turn to go into backsliding or apostasy and corrupt the religion by putting this figure in there, but then the next king would take it out. The impression that's given is that the temple was for Yahweh alone, except for these odd occasions when people went off the rails. But then you actually look at not the message the books are trying to give, but the facts they give, and you actually start totting up the number of years that the Asherah figure was in the temple, and you actually found the story actually tells is different to the point they're trying to make. That actually that image being in Solomon's temple was the norm. The majority of years, like 70% of the time that temple existed, even according to the Bible's own facts and figures, 70% of the time an image of Asherah was in the temple. So it's the times when a particularly reforming king would come and take those images out of the temple. That is the aberration. That's not the norm. And then you get these kings that would take the image out and burn it. But then his successor would just put it straight back in. So it's actually that having the image of Asherah in the Jerusalem temple was the norm, not the unusual part.
There was, we always go back to, the facts, the archaeology, what is the evidence? We have to go back to that, and you guys do. And then there was this for me in the book where there was a researcher that was looking at some Canaanite art, and we have the goat and the tree. And when I want you guys to go through this, because this, talk about a revelation, right? And I get to that part in the book, and again, I had to go back and check references and go back. For me, it was absolutely fascinating. But this is a part when we talk about the Bible or Bible relics or archaeology. It's tough to come by. It does surface, but here it did. Tell us about the goat and the tree.
This was something that was discovered a little while back by a lady called Ruth Hestrin, who is a curator at the Israeli Museum in Jerusalem. And although she was, had a position in that, she wasn't an academic biblical scholar, which is why what she discovered was ignored for so long. But eventually, it got published and taken notice of. It's a fairly complicated line of reasoning that she did. But she was just noticing that there was this image of a tree with two goats either side, sort of standing on their back legs, nibbling at it. But this was a Canaanite image, and it was acknowledged to be a symbol of Asherah. And, as we've said, Asherah was symbolized by a tree. In some other images, there's also the tree is rising from basically a pubic triangle, but also with the goats either side kind of nibbling at the tree. And what Ruth Hestrin started to put this complex of imagery together, starting with the Canaanite stuff, so this pre-Israel, but then realizing that the same images are found in Israelite iconography, which was the kind of big breakthrough for her to realize actually these are symbols of Asherah. People had seen these Israelite images for a long time and just said, oh, it's a couple of goats nibbling a tree. That's, but what she put together, also using some other symbolism from Egypt, was realizing that actually these were Israelite images of Asherah. And it's part of that whole thing, along with these inscriptions that we've talked about, and the figurines that we've talked about, that made realize that this imagery was used throughout the Israelite period, referring to Asherah, and obviously this is a fertility sort of nature aspect with the tree and sustaining the goats and things. That it showed how prevalent she'd been in that, and how the archaeology had shown that for a long time, but nobody had put it all together and noticed until Ruth Hestrin came along, outlined her argument, eventually was able to get it published in an archaeological journal, and now that's a kind of orthodoxy, these being symbols of Asherah, is understood by mainstream archaeology, but they don't always credit Ruth Hestrin.
I was just going to say, it's now. Well, it's now accepted in, as Clive said, in mainstream archaeology, but yet again, the average synagogue goer or church goer has no idea. And of course, poor Ruth Hestrin, it's kind of, it's accepted, they very rarely mention her name. So Ruth Hestrin. Right. She's got her name check. And about time too. That was an amazing piece of deduction.
Now, if I had, the other part about Ruth was, she's making these connections, and she goes to look at history and came up empty. That's the other part for me. She realized things were being erased or were erased. It was something that she should have known about. But if I had a rabbi on the show, you know what? I know a couple. I should get one on the phone right now. What do you think that they would have to say about this?
Actually, I really don't know.
I think there might be. I mean, if absolutely pressed, they might say, "Oh well, yes. I mean, yes, we've known about Asherah. Yeah, there's some sort of talk of her, being, worshipped by some pockets of people in the old days. But that, of course, was heresy. that was apostasy. Or maybe just simply not even know about it. It's a bit like, Christians. You can imagine. Over the years, we've had debates with them about various things. And you say, well, what about the Gnostic Gospels? And they'll say, well, even priests or vicars will say, well, we think we've heard of them, and it's a whole blanking one whole aspect of the religion, both the Judaic religion and Christianity, and it's usually to do with the feminine.
But I think the problem from a modern perspective, if you were debating with a rabbi, yes, there is now a grudging acknowledgement that yes, the feminine needs to be acknowledged, and there are streams, there are obviously sort of feminist forms of Judaism in which have female rabbis and that, and they're beginning to acknowledge that God has a feminine aspect. Which is all fine and good. But I'm thinking from a modern perspective, the problem with what we're saying in the book is it's also questioning the idea of monotheism. And I think that's a harder one to get over, because after saying for literally thousands of years, telling people it's monotheist, there's only one God, that's all we need to worry about, suddenly to say, actually, no, there were others. It's a harder one to get over. That you can gradually reintroduce the sacred feminine, and it is happening slowly. Not quickly enough. Happening within Christianity as well. Again, slowly, but actually questioning the basic monotheism is a tricky one.
Yeah, and the just plural gods is a tricky one to convey to most people now, because to most people, like we talk about the ancient Egyptian gods, and they instantly think about animal or bird-headed people, which is distasteful to a lot of modern people. So they wouldn't even try to get their heads around the idea of many gods. Although, interestingly, it's quite easy, for a Catholic to get his or her head around the idea of saints, representing different aspects of the divine life. But yes, it's a tricky one, and it will take as Clive said, an awful lot of realigning one's thought processes to understand the idea of many gods. But it's there, we're not making this up. It's there in the Hebrew Bible.
And what about the Dead Sea Scrolls?
They're important. It's the Dead Sea Scrolls are often looked at from a perspective of what they tell us about Jesus and the origins of Christianity, but they're equally important, if not more so, about what they tell us about the origins of Judaism. Because among the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are many copies of texts we know from the Bible, the books of the Bible. And they're the earliest written copies that we have. Everything else comes from much later. Even obviously those books had been around a long time. The original manuscripts have long since disappeared. So the earliest ones we have of certain books of the Bible are from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they show the things that had changed. They preserve a much more faithful original version of those books. One of the most telling things is that in those copies among the Dead Sea Scrolls, they use the term gods, where in the later Bible, the version we have now, they use the term angels. They actually show that even as late as the writing of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the copies of the books they had referred to the gods, Yahweh presiding over an assembly of the gods. This gets changed to angels later, but it's telling us that original form talked about multiple gods, even as late as that, even as late as the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are the last couple of centuries BC. So they tell us a lot about the Judaic religion as it's practiced at that time.
Before we head to the break, which would be in 2 minutes, is there a reference to Asherah anywhere in the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Off the top of my head, I don't recall, but I don't think there's a specific one, because it's not from any. It's not those books that are. It's not, for example, some of the books of Moses is where all the references to Asherah are, and the ones in the Dead Sea Scrolls are some of the later books, the Kings and Chronicles. So off the top of my head, might be wrong. Off the top of my head, I don't recall a specific reference to Asherah, but there are certainly references to the gods.
And the reason why I bring that up, and we only know about a small fraction of the Dead Sea Scrolls, so we need to be clear on that. There may be reasons for that, and one of them being Asherah. But do you think that she was starting to get her omissions right by the time the Dead Sea Scrolls started to get established and those were chronicled?
She'd been written out of the kind of mainstream religion, the one controlled by the temple in Jerusalem. She would already been written out by that period. But of course, the Qumran sect that wrote or had or preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls were a kind of dissident sect. So they didn't represent temple orthodoxy. What their actual attitude to the feminine was is hard to reconstruct from their books. But certainly Asherah she'd been erased by that period. We're talking about, say, around 450 BC, when it was then the governor of Jerusalem, whose name was Nehemiah, and his scribe Ezra. They rewrote the religion at that point, including rewriting the history, and really clamped down on what the ordinary people believed. Because in the past, the religion was only really the religion of the elite, the educated. They didn't really bother that much about what the peasants and people believed. But suddenly you get this period, very much like in Christianity, with the spread of parish churches, top-down kind of.
But also, of course, you mustn't forget that the ordinary people couldn't read or write, so they weren't going to leave records of what they were up to or who they were worshipping.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's how you control the masses, right?
Yeah.
There. Let's take our break. Our guest tonight, Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince. Of course, we are discussing their new book, When God Had a Wife. This is Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. We'll be right back with more after this short break. Stay with us. Welcome back, Fade to Black. I am your host, Jimmy Church. You can follow me on Twitter at JChurchRadio. Hashtag F2B is questions for myself for the guests tonight, Lynn and Clive. And there are literally hundreds of them, and I'm not going to be able to get to all of them tonight. But I wanted to ask you guys this, and I want to go back to the comments about Moses being Egyptian, and we're going to get back to that. How do you think the book is going to be received in the more fundamental sections of Jerusalem?
I don't think they're going to like it. But, again, there's very little what we're saying there that hasn't been said before. We're just putting it all together in one place as far as the that side of it is concerned. When we get to the kind of Christianity part, that it does fit with some of our own really original research in there to get a complete picture. But
fundamentalists of any sort really just stick to what they want to believe, and you can present evidence to the contrary till you're blue in the face, and they'll just stick to what they want to believe. So they probably won't, they won't even notice us. That's the usual. That's the usual response. They won't deign to notice us. We are beneath their notice. So that's the way it goes.
But hopefully it will start a similar process to what happened with the Gnostic Gospels that we were talking about earlier, where any specialist and theologian knew about them, but ordinary worshippers or ordinary churchgoers didn't. But in the end, it's got to the point where, they can't ignore that anymore. Hopefully it will start a similar process of just, putting the historical record straight.
Yeah.
There's no other reason for this,
Well, a direct question would be: is Tel Aviv scheduled for your book tour?
No, strangely enough.
Strangely enough, not. No, can't think why. No.
And because the Moses. Okay. Let me. I wanted to get back and say this. I'm a little scrambled at the moment, but I wanted to say this earlier. The outline, the abridged version of Genesis, how you guys lay it out in the beginning of the book, made perfect sense to me. And I've read the Bible a few times, and I've gone back. But the way that you laid it out on those few pages in the beginning of the book was perfect. It was really, really well done, and it made a lot of sense. So I wanted to get that out of the way. So everybody go. If you buy the book just for those 3 pages, you win. Is Osiris, and the that story of Osiris, and if you research Egypt and you read that story, everybody makes that parallel. Wait a minute, this is the Moses story, right? And was it rewritten to fit? You guys know what I'm saying. You know exactly what I'm suggesting here. That the two stories, the two histories, are the same.
Yes, I mean, I think that the Moses story, like many stories of these characters, has been heavily mythologized. Similar thing happened with Jesus as well. That people filled in the gaps with the story, bits that they didn't know, by borrowing from other myths, and that happened with Moses, being cast adrift on the Nile.
Yeah, it was common enough in those days. They did that. Yeah.
And these kind of things, it's what's led, for example, again, we come back to these biblical minimalists to say, it was all just a myth that the Hebrews borrowed. Moses never existed. But then you look at the other side of the argument, you think there are big problems with that. If he just invented this story of this character called Moses, the fact that Moses has an Egyptian name, for example.
A bit of a giveaway, yeah.
Let's talk about that for a second. That was a really good point in the book. Moses is a common reference to what?
Well, it's son of. It's son of a god. Normally, it comes at the end of a word. So, like Moses, son of Thoth. And actually, that's quite a good point because he's missing a bit. There should be something before Moses, but there isn't. But anyway.
But there are also other characters that have, again, it's recognized by scholars who have Egyptian names, and these are among the priests in the early part of the story. There's a character called Phineas. There's one called Hophni. These are actually Egyptian names. There's another character called Merari, which is Egyptian. One which isn't acknowledged, but we think should be, is Miriam, Moses' sister, which comes from an Egyptian word meaning beloved of. Often given to the daughters of pharaohs, as Moses was given to the sons. So there's actually a very strong body of evidence that the original priesthood that came out of Egypt and into the Promised Land were native Egyptians, not, they were actually led by an Egyptian group who were in charge of the religion.
Which kind of takes the ground from under the Exodus story, in a way. So, I mean, yes, it is, it's a huge thing to readjust your mind to if you've been brought up with the Exodus story as told in the Bible and traditionally told, because you get the whole Passover thing, and, but yes, I mean, Moses was almost certainly an Egyptian. And as Clive said, not just Moses.
It made a good movie, though.
Several
it made Charlton Heston a star. So and I say that in jest, everybody. Don't send me email. I say that in jest, not really. is that if all of this, when we look at the geography of where Jerusalem is and where the Giza Plateau is and Lower Egypt and what was going on there, geographically, these areas were all technically one and the same. You could walk from these from one area to the other. And if all of this foundation happened at 1500 BC in Egypt, right, 2000 BC, that all of these religions are connected, including Asherah and the way that things were represented.
Yeah, there were very strong connections between the Canaanite religions and Egypt and the other peoples around there. They kind of mixed and matched.
Well, yeah, and also, quite late on, towards the time of Jesus, there was this great seaport of Alexandria in Egypt, which was the great melting pot. I mean, they had Buddhists there. It was basically, you could find, I should imagine, huge numbers of different religions there, and they all lived in the same area, and they all interacted. So, we tend to think of the ancient world as being, it was Egypt there, and it was, so-and-so there, and it was entirely different. But as you say, it was walkable, or certainly sit on a donkey, and there was an awful lot of trade, an awful lot of debate, an awful lot of interaction between all these various cultures.
And the other point that I want to make about all of this, certainly in a geographical sense, is when we talk about Abraham and Ur, which is modern-day Turkey today, but on the border of Syria, Göbekli Tepe is actually right there too as well.
Yeah.
That, again, geographically, everything is all tied together.
Yeah, and the Bible stories tie them together because it has, for example, Abraham moving around a lot, as you say, from Turkey. He starts off in Mesopotamia, he goes to Egypt, he goes to what is the land that's been promised to them, to what became later holy sites of the religion. So in a way, the Bible emphasizes this kind of unity of all those territories by having the characters move around them a lot.
And
taking God with them.
That's right. And so I envision Asherah and Yahweh at the very same time with the same meaning through homes all the way through temples across this region. And that's the part that today, if this is missing today, but yet it was absolutely a foundation of everything in that entire geographical region. It's astounding to me. It's a mind-blowing concept.
It is, yes.
And you don't get much more of as you say, a foundation psychologically, apart from anything else, as a father and a mother, and so a god and a goddess. But also, one of the things I've always loved about the ancient Egyptian religion, which of course was hugely influential on Judeo-Christianity, is that their idea of the Trinity. Whereas in Christianity, you have, Father, Son, and assumed male Holy Ghost, Holy Spirit. But the ancient Egyptians had Father, Mother, and Child. And that is just so much healthier psychologically.
Do you think that, I think it's suggested somewhat in the book, but my imagination went in this direction while reading it, in that all of the references of God speaking, all of them, whether it's through the ark or the burning bush that Clive brought up earlier, all of these references to God speaking, was there an omission, a removal of maybe Asherah speaking, and that they had to turn it around to make it, coming from one God?
Yes, I mean, thinking about it, just logically, it must have been, one thing that we certainly reconstruct in the book is that, Asherah, as you would expect, had her own priesthood with male and female priests attached to the Jerusalem temple. Now, if you've got a priesthood, they will be, things will be flowing both ways. They'll be carrying invocations and prayers towards the goddess, but they will also be bringing her words back. And certainly it's something we find another strand of the book, which is very strong, is a tradition of prophetesses, of wise women who certainly existed, Deborah being the classic one, Miriam being an earlier one, Moses' sister. And they're described as prophetesses, which obviously means they bring the words of the god. And it's assumed to be a god, but isn't it more likely that they're bringing the words of the goddess?
Yeah, so you often hear about the prophetesses sitting under, a date palm or sitting under a tree, which is clear Asherah imagery. So, they are connected with her. So they're presumably priestesses.
And there must have been at some point where you have a leader of a community, right? That figure who comes in and says, God says we can't eat meat. Or whatever it is, because you need to have that reference. You can't say it came from aliens, right? You've got to say it came from God. So the community would, the meat is spoiled or whatever it is, and it's going to make them sick. And so you're going to say God said. There must have been references where that's, same leader. So I just spoke with Asherah, and Asherah says, right, that must have happened, right?
Yeah, it must have done.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And also it would be in areas of, childbirth, for example, where you would go to her. It's probably what these figurines were largely about. But you'd have a priest, you would pray to Asherah and you would get a message back, I would imagine.
Actually, of course, we don't know. I mean, but as you said, sort of using imagination, I mean, perhaps the Yahwist priests felt they were being undermined by the priestesses. Maybe there was some rivalry in the sense that, the priestesses might say, well, Asherah said that you're all naughty boys and nobody should listen to you. I mean, we don't know, do we? We just don't know. But I mean, it's possible there was a rivalry.
It must have been.
Yeah.
And the other part about when you look at it in those terms, there's, I think somebody said earlier, to the victor goes the spoils, right? Where God won out in the end. Is there another way to look at it?
Yep.
That's really it. And there's this process where, as we describe it in the book, is the invention of monotheism, and which appears to be just the results of some, in a way, historical accidents. Big tragedies happening to the people of Jerusalem, being invaded, being carried off to exile in Babylon, and the logic of having made a deal, made a covenant with Yahweh that he would protect them if they worshipped him, and suddenly things are going really badly for them, and they're thinking, well, God wouldn't break his promise. It must be us that's done it wrong. We don't worship him enough. We don't, because we also acknowledge other gods. So we better cut them out of it. And you gradually get rid of the other deities. Eventually, you're just left with the two, Yahweh and Asherah, God and goddess, and still bad things are happening to you. And you think, well, actually, we just got to worship him exclusively. So we need to cut even his wife out of it. And then by definition, what you're left with is a single male, very male deity.
And things are still going wrong, but they couldn't allow themselves to think like that.
Yeah. And that's the point where the whole thing gets rewritten. So it's kind of, it's pushed over the course of a few centuries towards this logic, become victim of their own logic. And eventually you end up in this place that nobody else had done before, where you've got rid of everything apart from your one male god.
And of course, it's not just the victors who are writing the history, a sort of straightforward, objective history. They're writing propaganda on their own behalf to propagandize, to push their own agenda. And of course, it really comes hard to modern day Jewish people and to modern day Christians to actually get their heads around the idea that what they might be reading in either the Old or the New Testament, the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament, is actually propaganda, because that undermines an awful lot of ancient traditional thinking about, what constitutes blasphemy, even, challenging the whole idea of God. But I mean, this is a whole sort of, inference of many of the things that we've turned up and put together.
Well, just like Nag Hammadi, right, where everything got flipped over. Yeah. If something like that surfaced with these direct, without question, references to Asherah, would the religious scholars and leaders accept that and go back and start to recognize the real history?
They might recognize the real history among themselves, but it would take an awful lot to make them let their congregations know about it. I mean, when you consider that, as you referenced Nag Hammadi, the discovery of the so-called Gnostic Gospels in 1945, most people now in church who attend churches don't know about them. They have no idea. And that was 1945, and they have been translated into English, and, they just don't know. And if they did know, they'd just take the traditional line that, basically they're not worth looking at, It's just one big sneer from the top down.
Yeah, and which is exactly what I'm hoping for, that maybe someday you would have somebody on television speaking to their congregation, right, on the radio, in books and video, where they are saying, okay, and by the way, God did have a wife. And her name was, and she said, and she was worshipped, and she did have her own cult, right? She had her own priesthood. Yeah. And these were the things that she was teaching back then. And that's a whole, you know what I mean? That's a paradigm shift that you can't measure. Oh, yes.
Yeah. But just to give an idea of, how long this process takes, the first academic book written by a biblical scholar arguing the case for Asherah being God's wife, came out in 1949. And it's like, who's heard of it? Then there was another, a classic book in 1967 by a guy called Raphael Paté called The Hebrew Goddess, which also, that was more about stuff in later Judaism than we're talking about, but it's still there. So that was 1967. And it's, these books have been around for a long time. They've been supported now by much more recent archaeological evidence, because these the earlier books are based more on the reading of the texts. But so it's been at least 50 years that this information in some form or another has been around. But as Lynn was saying, the average churchgoer, average synagogue goer still has no idea about it. And that's partly one of the reasons for writing the book, is to kind of collect all this stuff together from all the scattered sources and say, just look at this, look at what happens when you join all the dots between this.
And we've been talking a lot about, the Jewish side of things and the Hebrew side of things. But what about the Vatican side of things?
What about the Vatican? Yes.
Well, I mean, the other big part of the book and the reason for writing it for us is because these discoveries give a whole lot of context and background to what we think Jesus was about. That there was a heavy element of the sacred feminine and what Jesus taught, which is where Mary Magdalene comes in. Same reasons for writing her out of the New Testament now. But and once we understand how strong this sacred feminine goddess tradition had been in Judaism the earlier version of Judaism, the Hebrew religion, and how recently it had been attempted to suppress it. And of course, ideas like that are never completely erased. You realize it survived underground, and it starts to put a lot of context and understanding on what Jesus was trying to do, and Mary Magdalene.
Yeah, I mean, we over the course of 3 books, as we mentioned, the Temple of Revelation, Masks of Christ, and now When God Had a Wife, we've slightly shifted our position, but basically kept the same position, that Mary Magdalene was a priestess, and it was kind of what was she a priestess of? And we started off thinking, well, there's so many Egyptian references, as it were, to what they were about. It had to be ancient Egyptian religion. Now we've shifted it ever so slightly, really, to say it was ancient Egyptian, but in a sense it was also Jewish, because, of course, we now trace an awful lot of the Jewish religion back to Egypt anyway. And we believe the bottom line is that what Jesus was trying to do was trying to return the Jewish religion to its origins. And its origins were pretty Egyptian, but also, of course, they had a goddess. And we believe that's what Jesus was trying to do. And that if you like, the early Vatican, the very, very early Vatican, knew all that. But the last thing they wanted was to have, generations of women being inspired by Mary Magdalene. They didn't want women to be assertive or have a role in their religion that they were creating as a power base for themselves. And in doing that, what they did was effectively they insulted Jesus, and they did it quite deliberately because they knew that he adored Mary Magdalene and that he revered her, that he honored her as a priestess, and that he was trying to make sure that she had a legacy, and it just didn't happen. They weren't going to allow it to happen. They insulted him by, in effect, the irony is, and this is I know it's a very tough and harsh thing to say, but in effect, the Vatican, by creating what became Catholicism, were insulting Jesus.
And he consulted. He listened. He had conversations with her.
Yes, absolutely. And we know this not through the New Testament Gospels, because, she's hardly mentioned by name in there, but by the Gnostic Gospels, such as the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, that's Mary Magdalene, which, people on the whole in churches, certainly churchgoers, have no idea about. But they are incredibly valuable sources of information about the characters in Jesus's mission. I mean, yes, they are very fanciful when they start talking about the various cosmologies that they believed in, heaven and hell, and the 29 rings of hell, and if you commit this sin, you go to 29th rung and round the corner and up the stairs, and and it's all just ludicrous, and that of course is what traditional Christians seize on and say, oh, you shouldn't take any notice, they're just ridiculous books. But once they start describing Jesus and the individuals in his mission, it all leaps into sharp focus and all the nonsense falls away. And quite clearly, all of the books I mentioned, Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Philip, Gospel of Mary Magdalene, they all draw on a same source. And they quite clearly were not making it up, because if they were going to make something up, it would be all sweetness and light among Jesus and his disciples. But it isn't. And the one thing they all describe is how Simon Peter, St. Peter, hated Mary Magdalene. In fact, he hated all women. That's made absolutely clear. But he threatened to kill her. And she says to Jesus, I'm frightened of him. He hates me and all the race of women. And Peter, unbelievably, in this book, goes to Jesus and says, let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life. So, you really wouldn't make all that up if you were just making up something about Jesus and his disciples. I mean, this is obviously specific memories. So if you want to know anything about Mary as a person, because quite a lot of it is her personality shines through. If you want to know anything about Mary Magdalene as a person, or for that matter, Simon Peter as a person, Don't go to the New Testament, go to the Gnostic Gospels.
When I read, and you know what, we're right. Can we do some overtime? Can I keep you guys?
Yes.
We saw this coming, didn't we? Okay. And when we come back, believe it or not, I'm going to squeeze some UFOs into this conversation too as well. We'll do that when we come back, but we're going to continue with Mary and Jesus. And I have another specific question to kick things off. Stay right there. We're going to go into overtime with Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince. We're discussing their new book, When God Had a Wife. It was released yesterday here in the United States, and you can go to their website, picnicprince.com. The links are at Jimmy Church Radio. We'll be right back. More overtime after this short break. Stay with us. Welcome back to Fade to Black. That's right, overtime with Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince. You expected. I knew this was going to happen. Way too much to get out there. And I can't wait to get you guys back on the show where we can, focus on one subject and go deep. I wanted to make one comment on the Gnostic text. When I read through them, when I finally got the translations, I read through them and I was okay. I didn't freak out. I just thought this is just another piece to the puzzle, and we should accept it for what it is. And they were found for a reason. How they were found is an extraordinary story in itself. Much of them were burned, to heat homes, right? Yeah. And the portion that we got was a gift. And I really, I didn't freak out. I was actually okay with it.
I remember reading it and it just felt right.
Yes.
It just actually felt right. It felt, it did feel very modern in a sense, because apart, as I said, from all the mad cosmology, when it's talking about Jesus talking to disciples and them having a debate, it felt absolutely immediate. And in a modern sense, actually, as if it was a transcript of a meeting.
It was. And I'll tell you why it hit me that way. The versions of everything that we read today are watered down, translated, converted, Greek back to Latin, back to English, and we have a representative of the original text. That's what we have today. With the Gnostic, that was direct. That was not translated, and retranslated, watered down, and edited throughout time. It was a window of the past that was absolutely very direct, like you were there.
Yeah. It hadn't been edited at all, but simply because those books had been hidden for centuries and centuries, and so nobody had got their hands on them to do any editing.
Yeah, it was a fascinating read for me. Fascinating. Yeah. And I want to ask you a direct question to both of you. Lynn, I'm going to go to you first. How important is it to go back and rewrite history? How important is it to the world to go back and examine and present and correct? How important is it?
It's essential. At the same time as, as saying this is what we do, we revisit history, various aspects of history, various stories, various personalities, various traditions. But also we're very aware of that you can never get it absolutely right at a distance. We weren't there, all we can do is, as Clive said, kind of forensically delve and then piece together what we find and make a whole, make a story, make some kind of sense out of it all. But, you have to have a kind of humility about it, because you weren't there, and it's somebody else's story that you're trying to get right.
Clive?
And I would agree with what Lynn said. It is an essential thing, because, in a way, we are our history, so we have to try and get it as right as possible, while acknowledging the fact that as Lynn said, because we weren't there, we can't be absolutely sure, can't be 100% sure. But so much of what we do today and what we believe today is based on a particular version of history, a particular telling of history. And if you have to go back and look at that and challenge it in the light of new evidence, in the light of the new, particularly archaeological evidence, discoveries, like the Nag Hammadi texts, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, you have to take this new information on board and look at what you believed previously. For a long time, people believed that the Bible just was history and everything in it was true because they really had nothing else to compare it with. But in the modern age, we do. We have alternative texts, we have archaeological discoveries, and just to close your eyes to them and say, no, what we've always believed must be true, it's just wrong. And if it affects the way you look at history and it affects the belief, well, that's just something people have to take on board. But it is absolutely vital that we don't carry on sort of blundering into the future with these kind of blinkers on about the past.
Being complacent. Yeah, being complacent, we all lose.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. But also there's the thing too that we automatically, and it's obvious why, it's only natural, when we look back at history, we impose our own 21st century views on the people back then, and that is often just wrong. An example really is modern Christianity. Modern Christians think, what a terrible thing it would be if the first Christians were accused of what they would call sorcery or witchcraft or magic. But in fact, the early Christians, they practiced what we would call magic. They thought in magical terms. It's not some dreadful pagan thing. It's the Christians did it. And that was the mindset of the time. But we're imposing our modern view backwards. So we've got to be very, very aware of that and have a kind of humility and a respect for the people back then.
Now, I can't let you get away, Lynn, without me bringing up, you wrote a book called The Mammoth Book of UFOs.
I certainly did. Yes, I did.
You wrote a book called The Mammoth Book of UFOs.
Yeah.
And in that book, you point out a couple of things, but I want everybody to know, and you can go back and check this out. I'm speaking to the audience, and you can go and find the book. But this was written in 2001.
Yeah.
And some of the comments and the way that you presented the book then, here we are in 2019. Much of it now has not only come to pass, but it is a general way that we look at the UFO subject today. When you look at the way that UFOs are talked about today and the way that you wrote that book and your views on it, certainly about religion and demons and angels and religion, these are subjects that are talked about today in direct reference. Did you have a vision of the future? Did you know that this was going to be the way it was going to be discussed today?
No, I mean, I really didn't. I'd love to be able to say I did, of course, but that wouldn't be true. I just wrote what I thought, and from the evidence, as far as I could see, and I have actually seen a UFO myself back in the 80s. I thought, well, this is a phenomenon that is not just nuts and bolts. Sometimes it appears to be nuts and bolts, sometimes it doesn't. It's about a shape-shifting paranormal phenomenon, or a series of phenomena. And it does tie back to the old stories of, the appearances of demons or aliens or angels or fairies particularly, which does suggest to me that it's not so much extraterrestrials that we're looking at as some kind of extra-dimensional earth creatures that go back a very long way, what I call the true indigenous race. But, I don't know for certain, but the evidence seems to point in that direction to me. I mean, I am absolutely not a skeptic about the paranormal. I grew up in a haunted house. I've seen a UFO. This is very important to me. But to me, it doesn't necessarily suggest an extraterrestrial hypothesis.
And when we go back, and I want Clive's opinion on this too as well, but Lynn, let me ask you, when all of the research that you have done with religion, which is fairly complete, and a lot of unanswered questions, but your research is there. And when you research angels, demons, gods, information coming from the stars, from the heavens, is there a direct reference with religion going back that could be an alien presence? And as far out as that may seem, it seems the stories are nearly the same.
Well, I mean, I've been asked this quite a lot. And I would say, obviously, we don't know for certain. We just don't know. I mean, it could be. It could be that the ancient astronaut theory is correct. There could be variations on that theme. It could be that way back, some beings arrived, or ourselves from the future, or whatever, and then just arrived and were here for a relatively short space of time and went away, and then humanity just sort of recreated the story in different forms, and which became religion. Or it could simply be that there's no alien input. It's just a kind of two-way thing. Humanity has created almost as thought forms the gods, and they become archetypes, and then it's a two-way process. It's an endless recreation.
Right. And Clive brought up the burning bush, and if we take that, let's just take that as a real event. It's a real event. It really happened. But Moses, if that communication was with a voice, with an entity that God, E.T., whatever, but Moses comes off the hill and he needs to go and speak to the Israelites. He can't say, I was just speaking to somebody from Venus. And he's right. He can't do that. He has to say, it's God that I spoke with.
Well, and in his own terms, would he have understood, a being from Venus and what that meant? He would have had the mindset of his time, so he would have interpreted it as a god. It's something. The things we've been talking about most of tonight is the way these experiences were written and told many centuries later when the Hebrew Bible was created. Now, I'm sure Moses had an experience with the burning bush experience. Only he was there, so only he knew what happened. But then that story is passed down, and then many hundred years later, the temple authorities impose a specific meaning on that, and we don't know how much they may have changed what that experience was. But we find these experiences the whole time with, for example, when Jesus, after his baptism, it goes out into the wilderness and is tempted by Satan. He had an experience. Only he was there, and only he knew what it was, what the experience was. Say with Moses and the voice from the burning bush, he probably didn't know what the voice was either. So a lot of the, what becomes the core of a religion is based on an experience somebody had, an experience with the other. We could say extraterrestrial, a god, a thought form, something breaking in from another dimension, another realm. But, the only word, Lynn and I use of it is the other, because we don't know what else to call it. Mm-hmm. But all these religions always start with those experiences, but then there's layers of dogma put on top of them. And in the end, you don't actually know what that core experience was, other than that there must have been one.
And we see it time and time again. And what I find most fascinating with that is when you have Christianity or Catholicism, or, pick a religion that will stay on the angel side of things, the religious side of the experience. But today, when we talk about ghosts or parallel worlds or voices or entities, that isn't real. Right? They won't accept that, but they will accept the conversations that happen in the Bible.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. It's like, the paranormal is, it's tainted with the occult. We can't have that. That's right. Demonic, or that's evil. That's the dark side. At the same time as, pushing all the stories of miracles and raising from the dead and, and virgin birth. And to them, that's untouchable. You can't criticize it. You can't take it apart. But they have they feel they can just go for other people's beliefs.
Yeah. We can have conversations with angels, right? Yeah. That's okay. Yeah. Jesus can go and hang out with Satan, right? Yeah. That can happen. But today, if it happens, it is heretical. It's evil. It's a it's a paradox. I just don't understand.
You take the other point of view, the kind of skeptical, kind of scientific point of view, that you say all these things are illusions or delusions. They're just symptoms of mental illness or something.
Right.
So they're not real. So you've got those two things. Religion tries to impose a meaning one way, and then the very kind of materialist, rationalist scientist tries to deny any of this, religious or paranormal, ever happens. And yet these things have had a profound effect on our history.
Yeah, but also the specific cases of people having visions, quite recently, such as Bernadette, Saint Bernadette, who saw, what she actually saw was she described as a little thing, a little girl standing in a tree. She went and told the local priest about it, who instantly, because he was very into the whole, Virgin Mary cult, instantly he said, it was Virgin Mary, wasn't it? And she was a completely uneducated girl who was in awe of his learning and said, well, it must have been, But she sort of backtracked a bit. But basically, that's not what she saw. And he instantly imposed a meaning and a traditional meaning on it. And look what it's become, Bernadette of Lourdes, So that's one story. And you can see exactly what happened there.
Well, and Clive brings up, these are both great points. And Clive's point about, some type of psychosis or schizophrenia or science is going to say it's delusion or it's not real. That's the basis of their arguments today. But yet, Moses can listen to the Ten Commandments, right, and carve this into stone. That was a real event. It seems to me you can't have one without the other because they're the same story. It's the same experience.
Well, yeah. It's the same sort of thing. It's the other. It's the other intruding into our lives and making an enormous impact, through the visionary, and an enormous impact for millennia, basically. But on the other hand, the same people who take that absolutely literally on board are appalled. Anybody who is into nature worship or just think that's just beyond the pale.
Well, and should we, because I do, shouldn't we accept folklore and mythology that has been handed down traditionally? You guys live in the UK. Were some of the best,
yep.
Right? It's all based on something. It's based on some type of reality, isn't it?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes, we are big sort of fans of folklore and think it does tell us things. Again, a meaning gets imposed over the retelling of that story, but nevertheless, it begins with something it begins with a real experience of some kind. And the fascinating thing is to try and get back and work out what that original experience was. Often it's completely impossible. You really would have to be there. But nevertheless, it's it's fascinating trying to get back to that.
But also something that's very important, and obviously, Jimmy, you would agree with this, is that we don't go back and look at the stories and think, oh, they're just liars. Or they're just mad, which a lot of modern skeptics do, if they bother to look back at all at these stories of, say, encounters with fairies, classic encounters with fairies. And there's so much there in the old literal fairy stories that so resonate with modern encounters with euphonauts or contactee stories or alien abductions or whatever, and basically, are we looking at the same phenomenon, just simply dressed up for different cultures?
I want to thank both of you. I know we waited a few years for tonight, but it was certainly worth it. What an amazing conversation. Where can two quick questions. Where can everybody get the book? And are you guys going to be coming over to the States anytime soon?
Well, if somebody asks us, you never know, we might.
Yes, no plans to at the moment. Where they can get the book, well, certainly from Amazon, the usual places, and bookstores. And
through our website.
Sorry?
And through our website.
And through our website.
What about autograph? Do you guys sign them?
We haven't got a kind of mechanism for doing that, but we should.
We should. Yes. Yeah.
Yes, we needed to find some way of doing that. But we'll have to think about that.
Yeah.
But at the moment, we can't accept in bookstores. So someone will have to get us over to do a signing tour.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. And what about television? Are you guys doing anything?
Not as far as I know. We're doing an awful lot of radio, but at the moment, we haven't got any television lined up.
I mean, so we have not specifically promoting this. There are some TV shows that Lynn is involved in.
Oh, yes, indeed. Yes.
Coming around.
Yes, I mean, I've done Ancient Aliens, and the Series 6 of Forbidden History is just being filmed at the moment. So yes, there is television in the pipeline.
Yes, which is the question, right? And we're going to be coming over to the UK next year. We're going to make those announcements. Today is the 4th over here. We're going to make the announcements on the 7th. But we would love to come and hang out with you guys. That would be amazing.
It would be amazing. Let's do it. Let's do it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I look forward to having you guys on the show again. Thank you so much. Now go enjoy the rest of your day. It is now, what, is it 6 o'clock in the morning?
6 o'clock in the morning.
Back to bed, I think. No, but thank you. It's been a great pleasure.
It's been wonderful. Thanks so much, Jimmy.
Yeah, thank you so much. And like I said, enjoy the rest of your day and getting up this early. This audience really appreciates what you guys have done, and I want to thank you on behalf of the community for an extraordinary career. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Jimmy.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
And with that, I am going to wrap. We went straight to the credits tonight. Thank you so much, Lynn and Clive. And the book, you can go straight to picknettprints.com. The links are at jimmychurchradio.com. Click and head straight over. I am on my second read of the book. It's amazing. When God Had a Wife. Fade to Black's executive producer is Rita Camurian. Show is produced by Hilton J. Palm, Renee, Dennis, and Bob. Announcers are Steve Harder, Gene Vitoa, Mark D. Kovar. Webmaster is Drew the Geek. Music, Doug Aldrich. Intro, Spaceboy, spaceboymusic.com. Fade to Black is produced by KJCR. Excuse me. For the Game Changer Network, syndication is KGRA, The Planet. This broadcast is owned and copyrighted 2019 by Fade to Black and the Game Changer Network. It cannot be rebroadcast, downloaded, copied, or used anywhere in the known universe without written permission from Fade to Black and the Game Changer Network. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Tomorrow night, live from India, Deep Prasad is here. Until then, I want everybody to be safe. Go Beckley Tepe.